Ends, Lillian Carter walked through the terminal with a sense of anticipation in her heart, her travel bags rolling smoothly behind her. As she moved past the busy crowds of hurried passengers, her mind focused on the vacation she had dreamed of. For so long it had been years since she had taken time off for herself, years of working tirelessly, raising her family, and pushing through every obstacle life threw her way. This vacation was her reward, the moment she had been waiting for. She had saved every penny, worked overtime, and ensured everything was perfect for this trip. Her seat was booked months in advance, a first-class ticket to paradise. Nothing could ruin this moment, or so she thought. As she neared the check-in counter, she felt a small thrill. She was ready to be treated like royalty. After all the hard work she had put in, this was her moment. She approached the counter with a smile that matched her excitement. The young woman behind the desk greeted her warmly as Lillian handed over her ticket. But then the smile on the attendant's face began to fade as she scanned the details on the computer screen. Lillian noticed the shift, but didn't think much of it at first. The attendant paused for a moment before speaking, her voice somewhat flat and professional. "We're sorry, but it appears your first-class seat is no longer available. We've overbooked the flight, and you've been moved to economy class." Lillian blinked in disbelief. Surely there was some mistake. She had booked her seat months ago, confirmed everything weeks ahead. She had even received a notification reminding her of the flight. She looked at the attendant with a mixture of confusion and surprise. The attendant repeated the same line, but this time her tone was more rehearsed, less apologetic, as if she had dealt with this scenario countless times before. Lillian's stomach sank, but she held her composure, forcing a tight smile. "It's okay," she said. "I'll just take my seat." Then the attendant seemed relieved, as if she had expected a confrontation, and quickly handed her the boarding pass with a polite nod. Lillian walked away from the counter, still trying to process what had just happened. She had been looking forward to the luxury of first class, the extra legroom, the fine dining, the quiet space to unwind before her flight. But now she would have to make do in the cramped economy section. She could feel the sting of disappointment creeping in, but she refused to let it show. As she walked towards the gate, she glanced over her shoulder at the first-class area. The plush seats and elegant decor seemed to mock her. She pushed the thought away and focused on getting through the next few hours of the flight. But deep down she felt a flicker of anger. She had worked hard for this moment. She had earned it, and yet she was being treated like any other ordinary passenger. She found her seat in economy, nestled between two strangers, one of whom was already snoring loudly before the plane even took off, the other engrossed in a noisy video on their tablet. She tried to make herself comfortable, but it was impossible. The seat felt too small. Her knees pressed uncomfortably against the seat in front of her, and the lack of space made it hard to relax. All around her, the first-class passengers settled into their seats with ease. The flight attendants fussed over them with attentive care, while she sat there in the back of the plane feeling invisible. It was as if she didn't matter. The anger inside her grew, but she kept it hidden. Her eyes focused on the window as the plane ascended into the sky. She thought about the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the quiet struggles she had endured just to get here, and it felt like it had all been erased with one cold dismissal. Her dreams of comfort and relaxation slipping further away with every mile the plane flew. But as the hours passed, something inside her began to shift. It wasn't just anger, it was determination, a quiet resolve that this injustice would not go unpunished. This wasn't just about her seat anymore. This was about something bigger. She had been treated unfairly, and she was going to make sure that whoever was responsible would feel the weight of it. As the plane soared through the clouds, Lillian sat there quietly, her eyes fixed on the window, but her mind was racing. She couldn't stop replaying the scene at the check-in counter, the way the attendant had spoken to her, as if it were no big deal, like her confirmed first-class seat meant nothing to them. She had watched the young woman type away at the computer, barely looking up to offer any kind of empathy or apology, and it made her blood boil. The injustice of it all. She was no stranger to the sting of being overlooked and underestimated. But this felt different. This wasn't just another instance of being denied something. It was an open and clear dismissal of her worth as a passenger. Her time and money meant nothing to them, and that's what hurt the most. She looked around the cramped economy section, Where she was now seated, the space was narrow and uncomfortable. Passengers around her were talking loudly or fiddling with their electronic devices, but it all felt so distant to her, as if she were living in a world that didn't quite belong to her. Everything she had worked for, everything she had earned, felt so out of reach now. The first-class section was just a few rows ahead, and she could hear the soft clinking of glassware, the gentle laughter of those who were enjoying the luxuries of that section. It was a cruel contrast to the hum of economy class, where she sat squished between two strangers who barely acknowledged her existence. Her hands clenched around the armrest as she thought about what had happened. The anger she felt was no longer just a fleeting emotion. It was turning into something more, something deeper. She had been planning this vacation for months, working tirelessly to save for the experience, and now it was ruined by someone's careless mistake, or worse, deliberate oversight. She didn't know which was worse, but either way she wasn't going to let it slide. It wasn't just about a seat or a flight anymore. It was about dignity and respect. It was about being seen and treated as equal to the others who were sitting in first class, as if they were somehow more deserving of comfort and attention than she was. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, trying to focus on something positive, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. As the flight continued, she found herself thinking back on her life, the challenges she had faced as a black woman in a world that often overlooked her. Despite all her hard work, her accomplishments, her contributions, it had been a constant fight for recognition and respect from those in power. She had been overlooked for promotions, passed over for opportunities, and faced prejudice from people who assumed her worth based on her appearance or her age. She had learned to rise above it all. But this was different. Lillian's mind wandered to the years of sacrifice she had made to get to this point, the long hours she had worked, the nights spent studying when she should have been resting, the time she had put others before herself. All of it had led to this moment, her long-awaited vacation, her chance to enjoy the fruits of her labor. And yet here she was stuck in a seat that wasn't even hers, a seat she had not earned but was forced into because someone else had made a decision without her input, without any care for her rights as a paying customer. Her frustration began to swell as the plane continued its journey through the sky. She could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to shout, she wanted to stand up and demand answers, but she knew that wouldn't work. They would dismiss her even more if she did that. So instead, she did the only thing she could do in that moment. She internalized her anger and began to make a plan. She knew this wouldn't be the end. She wasn't going to let it go. She was determined to make them understand the impact of their actions. The hours dragged on, but inside Lillian's mind, a spark had been ignited. She was no longer just a woman on a plane. She was someone with a purpose and a mission to right the wrongs that had been done to her, and she would find a way to make sure it was felt in a way that couldn't be ignored. As the flight continued, Lillian sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. She couldn't let go of the image of the first-class passengers being pampered, while she was left to sit in cramped conditions. The contrast between her experience and theirs was stark, and it burned in her chest. As she looked around the plane, she couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible, of being treated as less than, of not deserving of the same treatment as everyone else in first class. She had paid for that seat, just like they had, but somehow it didn't matter to the airline or to the people who ran it. She wasn't important enough to be given what she had earned. Her eyes flicked over to the flight attendants who were busy serving drinks and snacks in the first-class cabin. Their faces were all smiles, their movements graceful, as they catered to the privileged few who occupied those seats. But there was nothing graceful about the way they had treated her. She was a paying customer just like the others, and yet she had been tossed aside without a second thought. She wanted to stand up and confront them right then and there, but she knew that wouldn't get her anywhere. It would only make things worse. So she remained silent, her fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest as the minutes stretched into hours. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the lights dimmed, Lillian leaned back in her seat, her mind still buzzing with frustration. She thought about how many times in her life she had been overlooked, dismissed, and told she wasn't good enough, how many times she had been passed over for promotions, for opportunities, for recognition, simply because of who she was, because of the color of her skin. It wasn't fair, But it was something she had learned to live with. She had learned to keep her head down, to do the work, to push through despite the obstacles. But this was different. This wasn't something she could ignore. This wasn't just a setback or an injustice that could be brushed aside. This was personal. She closed her eyes and thought back to the moment when she had first received the email confirming her first-class seat. It had felt like a victory to her, a symbol of all the hard work she had put in over the years. She had looked forward to that moment when she would finally get the luxury treatment she had always dreamed of. She had imagined herself sipping a drink, watching the clouds pass by in comfort. But now it all seemed like a cruel joke. As the hours ticked by in that tiny economy seat, she felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. The more she thought about it, the more her anger grew, and she knew she had to do something about it. It wasn't just about the seat, it wasn't just about the flight. It was about a lifetime of fighting for recognition and respect, only to have it denied time and time again. She had been patient for so long, but this time her patience was running out. She wasn't going to let this go. She was going to make them pay for treating her like this, for making her feel small, for making her feel less than what she was worth. By the time the plane began its descent, Lillian had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this go quietly. She wasn't going to walk away and forget about what had happened. She knew that if she didn't take action, it would eat away at her, and she couldn't let that happen. She wasn't someone who would just accept being mistreated. She had fought her whole life to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. She had earned the right to be treated with respect, and she was going to make sure that the airline knew that. She was done being invisible, done being ignored, done being dismissed. She wasn't just a passenger on a plane. She was someone who had a voice, and she was going to make it heard. She had already started planning in her mind the steps she would take to make them regret their actions, and by the time the plane landed, she knew her journey was just beginning. As the plane touched down and began to taxi toward the gate, Lillian sat motionless in her seat, her hands clenched tightly around the armrests. Her mind was no longer focused on the flight or the destination. It was focused on the injustice that had unfolded in front of her. She had been wronged in a way that felt impossible to ignore, and now she was determined to make sure that the airline understood just how much they had hurt her. The weight of the decision she had made earlier still pressed heavily on her, but there was no turning back now. She was no longer just a woman who had been mistreated. She was a woman with a purpose. As the plane came to a full stop, she remained seated as the other passengers around her rushed to gather their things and exit the aircraft. She wasn't in any hurry to leave. Her thoughts were too consumed with the plan she had begun to form in her mind. She had known for years that the system was broken, that certain people were given privileges simply because of their status, their wealth, their race. But what had happened to her on this flight was a new level of injustice. It wasn't just a mistake or a mix-up. It was an indication that in the eyes of the airline she didn't matter, no matter how much she paid or how much she had worked for it. She was nothing more than another invisible passenger who could be tossed aside when it was convenient. Lillian waited until the plane was mostly empty before she stood up and gathered her things. She made her way down the narrow aisle with slow, deliberate steps, ignoring the curious glances from the remaining passengers. She didn't care about their opinions. She wasn't walking out of that plane as a defeated woman. She was walking out with a fire in her belly. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't let this go unanswered. She had been disrespected in a way that no one should ever have to experience, and now it was time to make them pay. Once she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she immediately headed for the airport's customer service desk. Her footsteps were steady and determined as she approached the counter. The young woman behind the desk greeted her with a polite smile, but Lillian could see the nervousness in her eyes. It was as if the employee could sense that something wasn't right. "Excuse me, I need to speak with someone in charge," Lillian said, her voice calm but firm. The woman blinked and quickly nodded, signaling for a manager to approach. Lillian crossed her arms and waited, her patience growing thin. She didn't want to waste time explaining how she had been wronged again. She had already made up her mind what she was going to do next. She just needed the right person to help her do it. When the manager arrived, Lillian didn't mince words. She started with the facts, calmly explaining what had happened, how she had been assigned a first-class seat that had been taken away without explanation, and how she had been shoved into economy class, With no regard for the money and time she had invested in the flight, the manager listened with a polite but disinterested expression, nodding occasionally, as if trying to get through the conversation. As quickly as possible, Lillian could see that the manager didn't really care about her complaint, and that's when her anger flared up again. She wasn't going to let them dismiss her as just another customer. She wasn't going to let them treat her like she was invisible, like her worth didn't matter. She had worked too hard for this vacation, for this moment of rest, and she had earned her place in first class. Just like anyone else, the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. This wasn't just about her seat or her flight. It was about sending a message to the airline that they couldn't treat people like this and get away with it. "I don't want a refund, I don't want an apology," Lillian said, cutting off the manager's attempt to speak. "What I want is to make sure this never happens to anyone else again. I want to make sure that no one else has to endure what I've just been through." The manager looked taken aback by her words, but Lillian didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked away from the desk, her mind racing as she made her way through the terminal. She knew what she had to do next. It was time to make sure that the airline would feel the full weight of what they had done to her, and she wasn't going to stop until they did. As Lillian made her way through the terminal, she could feel the anger still simmering beneath her skin, but with every step it transformed into something else, something more focused and driven. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. She had been wronged in a way that couldn't be overlooked, and she wasn't going to let it slide like all the other injustices she had faced in her life. This one would be different. She would make sure of it. She had been humiliated, but now it was her turn to turn the tables. By the time she left the airport and entered the quiet of the evening streets, Lillian's mind was already racing with possibilities. She had spent years working in various industries and had learned a thing or two about how the system worked. She understood that fighting against an airline or any large corporation would take more than just anger and frustration. It would take strategy. She would need resources, influence, and patience if she wanted to make an impact. The first thing she did when she got home was sit down at her computer and begin researching the airline. She wanted to know everything about them, their history, their financial status, their stock prices, the names of key executives and board members. She spent hours digging through articles and reports, learning about the airline's operations and understanding how they made their money. The more she learned, the more she realized that her best option wasn't a public complaint or a lawsuit. It was something bigger, something more powerful. She knew that in order to make a real difference, she needed to take control. She needed to become a part of their world, not as a customer, but as someone who could influence the decisions they made and change the way they treated people like her. That meant buying into the airline. It meant purchasing shares and gaining a stake in the company. She was determined to own a part of what had wronged her and turn it into something that could never overlook anyone again. Lillian knew she couldn't do it alone. She reached out to a financial advisor, someone she had worked with in the past, who understood the intricacies of the stock market and how to play the game. They met at a local cafe, and she explained her plan to him in detail. He raised an eyebrow as she laid out the strategy, but after listening carefully, he gave her a knowing smile. "It's ambitious," he said, "but it's possible. If you're serious about this, we'll need to move fast and be strategic. There's no time to waste if you want to make a significant impact." She nodded firmly. "I'm ready. I've waited long enough for something like this to happen. Now I'm going to make it happen." The financial advisor helped her set up the necessary accounts and began assisting her in purchasing shares in the airline. Over the following weeks, Lillian became more and more involved in the process. Every day she spent hours analyzing stock trends and making careful purchases. She was learning the ins and outs of the market. But it wasn't enough to just buy shares. She also needed to position herself in a way that would allow her to influence change from within. She wasn't just buying stocks, she was buying power. As her holdings grew, so did her influence. She started to get noticed by the airline executives. As one of the major shareholders, they couldn't ignore her presence for long, and as she gained more control, her plans began to take shape. She wasn't content with just being a passive investor. She wanted to be a voice in the boardroom, a voice that would demand change, a voice that would ensure no one would ever be treated like she had been. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was bigger than just getting revenge for herself. It was about creating a legacy, something that would last beyond this one incident. She wanted to reshape the airline's policies from the inside and ensure that future generations of passengers would never face the same kind of disrespect she had endured. She wanted the airline to be a symbol of fairness and equality, a place where everyone, regardless of their background, would be treated with dignity and respect. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Lillian felt herself getting closer to her goal. She had already become one of the largest individual shareholders in the airline, and her presence was beginning to be felt behind the scenes. Her name was appearing more frequently in boardroom discussions and financial reports. She was no longer just an anonymous passenger lost in the crowd. She was a force to be reckoned with. She had the ear of the people who made the decisions, and now it was time to take her plan to the next level. It started with small meetings behind closed doors. At first, it was just a few phone calls with executives who were curious about her growing influence and wanted to know more about her intentions. Lillian used these conversations to her advantage. She was always calm and composed, her words measured and deliberate. She didn't speak out of anger, she spoke out of conviction. This was not about revenge, it was about justice, and she made sure they understood that she wasn't going to let the airline continue operating as it always had, not while she was in control. Her first major breakthrough came when she was invited to attend a special shareholders meeting. She knew this was her chance to make her voice heard, to speak directly to the people who held the power to change the way things were done. She spent days preparing for the meeting, carefully crafting her speech, making sure that every word would land with the impact she wanted. She didn't want to just make a statement, she wanted to spark change, and she knew that if she played her cards right, she could do just that. On the day of the meeting, Lillian arrived early. She was calm on the outside, but inside her heart was pounding. She walked into the room full of top executives and major shareholders who looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity. Some eyed her with skepticism, others with faint recognition. They had all heard of her by now, but no one quite knew what to expect from her. As she took her seat at the table, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She was no longer just the woman who had been dismissed from first class. She was now a voice that could make or break their decisions. The meeting began with the usual updates and financial reports, but Lillian wasn't here to talk numbers. She had come for something bigger, and when the time was right, she stood up and took the floor. The room went silent as all eyes turned to her. She began speaking slowly, at first her voice steady and strong. "And I am here today, not just as a shareholder, but as someone who has been wronged by this company." She paused to let her words sink in. "I have spent years working hard to earn my place in this world, and I came to you as a customer expecting to be treated with the same dignity and respect as everyone else, yet I was dismissed and ignored as if I didn't matter." She looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the executives. As she spoke, the anger she had been holding back for weeks simmered just below the surface, but she kept it under control. Her message was clear. "I was forced into a seat that was not mine and told to accept it with no explanation and no apology. And this is not just about me. This is about all the passengers who are treated as nothing more than a number, who are brushed aside when they are not seen as valuable enough." Lillian's words hung in the air, her voice echoing in the room as she continued to speak about the many passengers who had been denied the service they paid for, the unfair treatment that had become a norm in the airline industry. She didn't just talk about the problem, she offered solutions, a plan to ensure that every passenger would be treated fairly regardless of their status or background, a way to bring more accountability to the airline's practices. The executives listened in stunned silence, her words cutting through the room with a sharp clarity. They hadn't expected this from her. They hadn't expected a woman who had been so quietly underestimated to stand up and demand such a powerful change. But as she finished her speech, she knew she had made an impact, and as the meeting concluded, the executives left with something they hadn't anticipated, a sense of urgency to change. The days following the shareholder meeting were tense. The executives were clearly shaken by Lillian's bold speech, and the plan she had proposed behind closed doors. Conversations were happening that Lillian wasn't a part of, but she knew her words had left a lasting impact. She could feel the shift in the air, the quiet acknowledgement that things couldn't continue as they were, not when someone like her had the power to expose the cracks in the system. The changes she suggested weren't just about improving customer service. They were about completely overhauling the way the airline operated, the way it treated its passengers from top to bottom. And the executives knew that if they didn't act swiftly, they risked losing their influence to someone who was determined to make them see the world differently. Lillian spent the next few weeks meeting with more key players within the company, gaining allies who supported her vision for change. She was building momentum, but she also knew that not everyone was on her side. There were still those who saw her as a threat to their control and power, those who believed the status quo should remain untouched. They dismissed her ideas as unrealistic. But Lillian wasn't discouraged. She had faced opposition her whole life. And this was no different. She had learned how to navigate the murky waters of corporate politics, and she was prepared to play the long game. She knew that in order to succeed, she would need more than just a few supporters. She needed to create a coalition within the company that would work in her favor and force the hand of those who resisted change. One evening, she was called into a private meeting with the airline CEO, a man who had been in the industry for decades and who was known for his hard-nosed approach to business. The meeting took place in a large glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Lillian entered the room with calm confidence. The CEO looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He had heard about her from his executives, and he wanted to see for himself what she was all about. Lillian took a seat across from him without hesitation, her eyes steady on his. As she began to speak, "I've made my intentions clear. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to make sure this company doesn't continue to treat its passengers like numbers." She paused, letting her words settle, and the CEO leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, and he regarded her with a skeptical look. "So you think you can change everything?" he asked, his voice cold and disinterested. "I know I can," Lillian replied with quiet certainty, "because this is bigger than just a seat on a plane. This is about respect and fairness, something this company has failed to offer for far too long." She could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly what she was talking about, but he wasn't ready to concede yet. He wanted to test her to see if she would back down, or if she was truly as formidable as the rumors suggested. "You do realize that making these changes will cost the company millions, don't you?" he asked, his tone more pointed now. Lillian met his gaze without flinching. "I understand the financial implications, but sometimes doing the right thing isn't about the immediate bottom line. It's about long-term sustainability and reputation. People are starting to take notice of how this airline treats its passengers. If you don't change it now, it's going to cost you more than money. It will cost you your place in the industry." There was a long pause as the CEO looked at her, considering her words. He had clearly underestimated her from the beginning, but now it was clear that she wasn't going to back down. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew she had a point. The airline's reputation was at risk, and it would take more than just superficial changes to win back the trust of the public. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "This isn't going to be easy. You realize that, right? Making these changes is going to require a complete overhaul of our policies and systems." Lillian nodded. She was ready for that. She knew that real change required sacrifice and hard work, but she was committed. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every passenger who had been overlooked, disrespected, and dismissed by the airline industry. "I'm ready," she said quietly, "and I'll make sure you are too." In the weeks that followed, Lillian became a constant presence in the boardroom, and behind the scenes of the airline's operations. She pushed relentlessly for the changes she had promised, and though the resistance was fierce, she was gaining ground every day. The CEO, who had once doubted her, now found himself in meetings with her regularly. They argued and debated, but with each conversation, he saw that Lillian wasn't just a disruptor. She was a visionary, and her ideas were beginning to take shape. She wasn't afraid to demand answers, and didn't back down from challenging the old systems that had perpetuated the very issues she was fighting against. Slowly but surely, the changes she advocated for began to be implemented. Policies were rewritten, new training programs for employees were developed, and the airline's customer service procedures were overhauled. But Lillian wasn't satisfied with just those surface-level changes. She knew that to truly transform the company, it had to be more than just policy shifts. She wanted to create a culture of respect and equality, something that would last long after the initial changes were made. She began working on initiatives that would promote diversity in hiring and ensure that every passenger, no matter their background, was treated with the dignity they deserved. She also made sure that the company's leadership reflected the diversity she wanted to see throughout the airline. She knew that real change started from the top and trickled down to the bottom. At the same time, she continued to expand her influence in the company. As more of the executives came to understand her vision and her drive, they started to join her in pushing for a new direction. Some of them even came to her for advice on how to better engage with the public and how to improve the airline's overall image. As word spread about the changes taking place behind closed doors, the public began to take notice. They saw that Lillian wasn't just an investor looking for profit. She was a champion for fairness and equality. And slowly the airline's reputation began to shift. What had once been a company known for ignoring its customers and favoring the wealthy was now becoming a symbol of change and progress. Lillian knew there was still much work to be done, but she could see the fruits of her labor beginning to blossom. The airline's customer satisfaction scores rose steadily as more and more passengers began to feel the impact of the new policies and programs. And though some of the executives who had resisted her in the past still grumbled and fought against the changes, they were now in the minority. They had no choice but to fall in line or risk being left behind. One day Lillian received a letter from a passenger who had been part of the airline's newly revamped first-class program. The letter was simple but heartfelt. It thanked her for the improvements the customer had noticed in the way the staff interacted with passengers and how they felt respected for the first time in a long while. They felt like they mattered to the airline, and the letter made Lillian pause for a moment. As she read it, she knew the changes were making a difference, but hearing it from someone who had experienced them firsthand made the effort feel all the more worthwhile. She smiled as she placed the letter on her desk. She had done it. She had turned a moment of rejection into a moment of transformation, and in doing so she had created something much bigger than herself. Her work wasn't done, though. Lillian was determined to ensure the airline continued down this path of improvement. She had built a foundation of change, but she knew that without constant effort and vigilance, it could all slip away. She remained vigilant, watching over the company, making sure that the commitment to fairness and respect didn't waver. She used her influence to continue pushing for policies that would not only serve the airline's customers, but also its employees. She wanted to make sure that everyone from the ground crew to the executives felt valued and treated with the same dignity that had once been denied to her. As the months passed, Lillian's vision for the airline became reality, and her legacy was cemented. She had started out as a woman rejected from a seat in first class, but now she was at the helm of a company that was known for its commitment to fairness and respect. She had fought for something bigger than herself, and in the process she had changed an entire industry.